All right, this lecture is going to be for the Friday online class, and we're picking up where we left off with the next step in our scientific method. So, of course, we've already talked about formulating your research question, developing your theory and your hypothesis. So now we have to actually carry out the research that will either end up supporting or refuting your hypothesis and explanation. Remember, though, that we said our goal is always to prove ourselves wrong. Now, any good scientific idea or question, it should be testable. This is known as falsifiability. It's the principle that you should be able to falsify the theory. It doesn't mean you always will, right? We go in with the goal of proving ourselves wrong, but you may not necessarily do that. You might actually prove yourself right. Like you might actually find what your hypothesis expected that you would find, but you should always be able to test something. If you are unable to test it, meaning it is not something that we can measure in some way or observe in some way, then it is not necessarily sound scientific research or scientific study, subject of study. So doing this, carrying out the research, of course, moves the science forward. Even when you find your hypothesis to be false, you're still producing results from the research that you found. So you would state, and a lot of research will do this. They'll state in their discussion, we expected to find this, but what we actually found was this other thing. And that leads to all of these other questions that we now have. So usually, your results either way, whether they prove your hypothesis correct or incorrect, many new research ideas and theories are going to be produced from that, and new research studies will be conducted, and it will get closer and closer to the theory that then holds up, the hypothesis that is proven correct, and then that will be replicated enough times that the data supports that overall theory that we had. And then, of course, last step, we write up our findings. So the purpose of this is to present our findings to the scientific community. We're not just doing research just for fun, or just to keep our minds busy, right? Those are perks, I suppose. But the entire point of doing research is to get the findings out to the scientific community to say, hey, here's what we looked at, here's what we researched. Here's what we found, but here's all the questions we still have. Scientific community, we need help, right? So this is when people will replicate. This is when people will run a slightly different study and see if they get similar or different results. And all of that research combined is going to move our science forward on that topic that we are looking at. Now, all published scientific evidence that is published in, trustworthy journals, okay, go through a peer review process. So essentially what you do is you submit your write-up of your research, you submit your findings to a journal. And then that journal will identify a panel of experts. Typically, these experts are experts in the area that you are investigating, right? So that they fully understand what it is that you're doing. And they will judge the merits of your research. So they're going to read your article, they're going to look at everything you did, look at whether or not you had experimental control, what were your variables that you were looking at, what were the findings, did you find what you say you found, and so on and so forth. So they're going to judge it. It's going to go through this whole process. It usually takes a few months. There's usually at least 3 reviewers, possibly 4, depending on the journal. And it needs usually a majority to say, yes, this is sound research. It should be published before it's actually published. So this is called the peer review process. Now, in this class, you will be using and looking at articles from journals that have gone through this peer review process. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of that peer review process and what it means for the validity of the findings that you are seeing and the data that comes out of that. Over the past several years, it has become more common for us to see people saying, well, I did my own research, right? Or findings being made by one person or one lab or one set of scientists. And even though the rest of the scientific community is saying that's not accurate, they're coming out anyways and saying, well, this is our research, this is what we found, and this is accurate. And you really can find endless amount of articles and papers and people's opinions on any number of things that could support or refute what your opinion is, right? Or what your own research shows you. Even in our algorithms on our apps, they're definitely putting you in a realm of you just seeing and hearing all of the same things, right? You get caught in that echo chamber of your opinions and your beliefs based on the algorithm, but it's not necessarily accurate research, right? And that is something that we are always looking for. Now, if the articles and the journal put it through the peer review process, then we have confidence in saying, okay, this research, not only was it done, it was probably done for free. There's no money involved there, right? It then went through the peer review process, which also the reviewers do not get any money for reviewing that research. It is done by volunteer for free. If it's gone through that entire process and it's still found to be sound data and sound findings, then you can have confidence that what you are reading in that research article is truly coming from a foundation of the scientific principles that we have, the scientific method, and so on. So it's really important, and I'm going to challenge you guys this semester, especially. It's really important to keep in mind that when you're researching certain topics, especially hot topics right now, right? Efficacy of vaccinations, things that do result in possible autism diagnoses, other different intellectual disabilities and what might cause those, and so on and so forth. The best place to look for that information is not through Google, okay? It's not through Google, it's not through social media. It's actually through medical journals or psychological journals, behavioral journals, where the studies and the findings have gone through this very rigorous evaluation in a peer review. And you guys are very lucky that you have access to that for free. The general public does not. And so that does make it more difficult. You can still find it, but you have to be pretty determined to find peer-reviewed journals and articles as a normal public person in society. You as students, myself as a professor here at Sac State, we have access to all of the journals that the university pays for memberships to, which is all of the scientific journals that we have access to, right? So take advantage of that while you're here. Take advantage of that now because, over the next however many years you're at Sac State, research a bunch of stuff, anything that has got you curious, anything that's going on in our world that makes you go, huh, is that really true? Let me go to the peer-reviewed scientific journals and let me see if that's actually accurate, right? Use it while you have access to it because not everyone does. And it is a privilege to have access to all of those. Okay, so why is it so important, right? Why am I hounding on us using this scientific method and the specific steps that are outlined and doing exactly what those steps say to do? The advantage of this, of using a scientific method or a scientific approach, is it provides an objective set of rules that is applied to the entire scientific community for gathering, evaluating, and reporting information, right? It's basically saying everyone has to play by the same rules. Everyone has to abide by the same restrictions and the same methods and the same steps as everybody else. And so we know we're all starting from the same place. We're all going through the same process. And this is very important because when we go to replicate and our findings either refute or support others in the scientific community, that is possible because we're all adhering to those same set of objective rules. If we were all doing it flying by the seat of our pants, doing whatever we felt like, it's impossible to compare findings from one lab to findings of another lab because they're doing different stuff, right? They're doing different steps and they're doing different methods. It's not going to work. So, in order for us to move science forward, to replicate findings, to really make sure that what we're doing is valid and sound, we all have to play by the same rules. Okay. We have to have that objective set of rules that never changes, that we as scientists all agree to abide by. Now, many people outside of the scientific community are going to rely on something completely different. You, as a scientist, and that's what you are becoming now this semester, okay? It is your duty, it is your job to make sure that you do not do this. But many people rely on their own intuition or anecdotes to draw conclusions about the world around them. It's just their own feelings, their own thoughts, their own opinions. And I've talked about this. The problem is that biases can come into play in a major way. You have numerous biases that you bring with you anywhere in life, depending on your learning history, the experiences that you've had before from childhood to now. Um, you're going to bring some bias into any situation that you go into, right? Even something as simple as, let's say, we go to Taco Bell. So like my favorite fast food restaurant is Taco Bell. I know it's terrible, but it's my favorite. And a girlfriend of mine hates it, right? So if we were making making decisions based on our intuitions, I would say, well, I just feel like Taco Bell's the best. And she would be like, well, I just feel like Taco Bell's the worst. And how do you really compare those two things, right? Like, how do you accurately, and this is, you can blow this up on a larger scale for any number of topics, right? I'm really pulling it into something very simple, but how do you even begin to debate if Taco Bell is the best, when all you're saying is, well, it's my opinion. It's my opinion that it's the best, so it's the best. And she's saying, well, it's my opinion that it's the worst, so it's the worst. And how do you ever come to any sort of conclusion together on that? You can't, right? Neither of you are coming from any sort of set of objective rules or measurements that we're going to look at. Now, if we sat down and said, okay, we're going to count the number of times that you get sick after you eat this certain food and the number of times I get sick. And we're going to compare those things, or we have to eat the same exact items. And then do I feel okay? Do you feel okay? And so on and so forth, right? We have to have some level of control and some rules set in place if we're actually going to dispute whether or not Taco Bell is the best fast food restaurant, right? So most people don't do that though, right? Most people are using their intuition, their own personal thoughts and feelings, and make a judgment, their own judgment about whatever topic it is that they are looking at and having an opinion on. And that is not sound science, okay? You can have an opinion. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but that does not mean that it's right, okay? Just because you say something doesn't mean it's correct or doesn't mean it's true. Um, Anecdotes are another thing that people often use, right? Anecdote is like a single story about someone's experience. And usually these are funny stories that get passed on over years and over time. They're like, oh, but my great great uncle said, right? So that's an anecdote. But if they're using that to actually make decisions based on certain things, then that's probably not accurate, right? If you're just using the single origin story to fuel your belief or your opinion about something, that it's probably not based in sound research. So, um, an example of this, I'll give you an example of this. So my great uncle um, drank whiskey every night before bed. And he always used to tell us, I remember as a child, him telling us all the time, probably not the best thing to tell the kids, but he's like, you got to drink a glass of whiskey every night. It's going to prevent you from having a heart attack. I've drank a glass of whiskey every night since I was an adult, and I've never had a heart attack, and I've never had any heart issues, right? That's an anecdote. And it gets passed on over and over and over again. But if you are actually engaging in certain behaviors based on that anecdote, well, it's not based on any research, right? It's not based on sound findings. I don't know if a glass of whiskey every night prevents you from having a heart attack. I would guess probably not, but you never know. But this is purely based on a single story of someone's experience. But people actually use this to make a statement, right? I might say to someone, "Oh, you have to drink a glass of whiskey every night before bed. It prevents heart conditions. It prevents heart attacks." Now, if I say it with that level of certainty, you might go, "Huh, is that true? Like maybe that is true." Oh, and then you tell your friend, "Hey, like I heard the other day that whiskey, if you drink a glass of whiskey, then it prevents heart attacks." And they're like, "Oh, that's cool." And then before you know it, nobody knows where that story came from. Nobody knows that it came from my great uncle who had no idea what he was talking about because he's not a medical professional. But we've now stated it as fact when really it is not rooted in any substance of research or rules or anything that we would say is actual sound research. Um, this book also gives another example of this. So they talk about an example of individuals who adopt. So after they've tried to have a child for a very long time, they might finally become pregnant after they adopt, right? So if people depend only on their intuition and anecdotal evidence and nothing else, they might come to a very different conclusion than what is scientifically true of that phenomenon, right? There is a phenomenon that you might try to have a child for a significant amount of time. You finally stop trying. So you essentially give up on that and you adopt a child of your own. And then sometimes those people who struggled for years and years and years, they're not even trying. And lo and behold, they get pregnant, right? If someone's basing that on intuition and anecdotal evidence, they would say, well, it's because they got adopted. You have to adopt and then you'll get pregnant. Like that's just what happens. That's just the way it happens. When in fact, nothing really has to do with the other. Usually, if this does happen with a couple, there are a lot of biological things that can go on in either the male or female's body, usually related to stress. So stress produces all kinds of different chemicals in the body, right? Cortisol, adrenaline, and so on and so forth. And so when you have a high production of those chemicals in the body, it also prevents the ability to become pregnant, and also other systems don't function at 100% capacity because your stress is sort of impeding on the functioning of those systems. My goodness, couldn't get the word out. So it's not just because, oh, well, they adopted, so of course then they got pregnant. No, no. There's probably a scientific explanation, which there is, there's a biological occurrence that is happening. And after you adopt someone, maybe you're not as stressed about having a child. You now have adopted this child who you love and you're invested in, and you're focused on that, and you're not so stressed out all the time about always trying to get pregnant and constantly focusing on that, that now those chemicals are not in balance, and now some of those systems can work better than they were working before, and that may make a more supportive environment in the body for becoming pregnant. So research and data, guys. Research and data. I can't hammer that home enough, right? Not intuition, not your own beliefs, not your own opinion, not an anecdote. And in examples like this too, like the pregnancy example I gave, where both events are kind of big, they're noticeable events. Like adoption and pregnancy are big things that people notice, right? Like they notice when someone adopts a child, we notice when someone is pregnant. These are visible things we can see. Something called illusory correlation can occur. This is a cognitive bias that we have and that we engage in. Essentially, when this happens, so when two big events happen, so let's stick with the adoption and pregnancy example, you're paying attention and it's out of the norm. It's surprising, right? If you knew that that couple has struggled, let's say for 7 years, and they've never been able to have children, and then they adopt. Well, the adoption is a big event, but also it's a big event that they've tried for 7 years and they cannot have their own child. So then think of how huge that event is if they then then release a pregnancy announcement, months or maybe even a year later. You're paying attention to these things because they are big events that are happening and they're out of the norm. They're surprising. And so you might draw the conclusion that adoption caused the pregnancy because one followed the other. But that is not the case. That is just correlation. We're going to talk a lot in this class about correlation versus causation. Correlation just means that two variables happen to be changing at the same time. When one variable changes, another one does. That does not mean causation because causation means a change in one variable actually causes a change in another variable, which means the second variable would not change if we didn't have a change in the first. So what we would be saying, if this was causation, if the adoption and pregnancy was causation, we would say adopting a child causes you to become pregnant. We know that that's not true, right? These are just correlational variables that happen to move sometimes at the same time. Not all couples get pregnant after they've adopted. Some do, right? So this is a correlation. This is not a causation. But it's an illusory correlation when people look at those two big events, those two variables that they're paying attention to, and they draw conclusions of causation. They're like, oh, well, it caused them to get pregnant. Once they adopted, that caused them to get pregnant. So be wary of any time research makes a causation statement. You want to really look at the findings of that. You want to really look at that research. When they say this caused this, that's a pretty big statement. You are saying that those two variables do not change unless one variable changes and impacts the other. And that's not always the case. So we do need to be careful with those statements. Another thing that often influences our viewpoints and sometimes research is the influence of authority, right? The people that we view in authority. So when we're talking about like persuasion, and when we look at this in psychology and psychology in general, there is a field of psychology that looks at this, that looks at persuasive messaging, authority, and how that impacts our behavior. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to get into some studies that were done early on that are no longer ethical, but we're going to talk about that, right? We're going to talk about how authority impacts our behavior. But the source that the message is coming from that you are hearing, when you hear a message, the source is the person that it comes from. So you are more likely to be persuaded or to be convinced that something is true, that what they're saying is accurate, if they seem prestigious to you or trustworthy, or you think they're respectable, or they have some level of authority that is leading you to believe that they should be believed. And when that happens, you're more likely to say, oh, well, they said it's true, so it must be true. That is happening a lot right now. That's happening a lot right now in our world, but a lot in this country right now, where someone in authority says something and many people, not all, but many people just believe it because, well, that person's in charge and they say that's the truth, so it must be the truth, right? And this is why many people are very quick to believe and accept anything that they find on the internet if it comes from a source of authority. And that can be any number of authorities, right? That can be a celebrity, that can be a government official, it can be a religious figure, and so on. So it doesn't necessarily mean just one type of authority. There are many different types, and people often will quickly believe something if they see that person that's saying it as a reliable authority. Scientific method, though, rejects this. It rejects the idea that you should accept a statement of any kind just because authority said it. Like we should just accept what they say on blind faith. Absolutely not, right? We as scientists know that. As being part of the scientific community, are going to learn and hopefully know by the end of this class that that's not how you should accept truth. You should question it. If someone says a statement that is a strong statement, you should say, I wonder how they came to that conclusion. Let me do some research. And you're lucky that you can do the research in those peer-reviewed journals. You should be able to see the proof, the results, the data, the findings. If you can't see that and you can't see that from multiple studies, then there's a problem. Um, Oh, I had some things on the slide for what I was just saying. I was just saying everything, but yeah, persuasion, it's the message source and their characteristics, right? Do we view them as authority? Do we view them as trustworthy? Do we view them as someone we can listen to? And are you just taking what they say for granted? You're just like, okay, well, they said it, so I'm gonna believe it. But always knowing that we as scientists, we don't come to our truths that way. We do so through the scientific method, through research, through repeated research, and sound findings and data. Scientists also recognize that our intuition, our anecdotes, and even authority are often just sources of ideas about behavior, but the ideas that they're presenting are flawed. The sources that they're deriving them are sometimes also flawed, right? They're not necessarily getting their data from all the peer-reviewed articles. If a celebrity is saying an opinion, it doesn't mean that they went and did all their research. They're just saying what they think. So as a scientist and a consumer of research, you want to have a healthy dose of skepticism. I drive my family nuts, right? Because especially in this climate that we're in, whenever one of them says, "Oh, well, I saw this research or I did this research," and I'm like, "Oh, but where did it come from? Oh, but what journal did you read? Oh, but what article?" And they're like, "Okay, like we get it. We need the source, right? I'm a hammer in. You gotta be a skeptic. You gotta hear what is being told to you and say, I want to look at the study. I want to see the findings. Even as you're reading a research article, you should still be skeptical unless they've proven to you that their findings are sound, right? So you'll ask questions like, was there experimental control and how did you achieve that? How did you collect your data? Did you make sure there was no bias involved? Um, is what you're saying your findings found actually what you found? Like sometimes people will get data and they'll interpret it pretty wildly. And then you'll read the article and you're like, nah, I don't think so. I don't think that's actually what you found. You're saying that's what you found, but that's not what your data is showing. So this is something that scientists practice all the time, skepticism. Look at every idea that needs to be evaluated, and it should be evaluated based on careful logic and results from scientific investigations alone. We also have something called empiricism that states knowledge to come directly from observations made, objective observations of people's behavior. And this results in data that can be used to make conclusions about whatever topic it is that you're investigating. In our case, it's human behavior, right? So we should have objective observations of this behavior that we're making. There are lots of different ways to do that. We're going to get into it, all those different ways this semester, so I'm not going to go into it now. But there are various ways that we prove that we had control in the research study so that we know that the knowledge we're coming to, the findings and the data that we're producing, is coming from objective observations and not from opinion or bias. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with having an opinion or belief system about something. We have opinions all the time. The simple one I gave you of the Taco Bell opinion, right? That is my opinion. And it's not really based in any research other than I love Taco Bell. I've always felt fine after eating Taco Bell. So, like, I think it's great. Um, but as long as we clearly state that it's an opinion, right? I very readily say that's just my opinion. That's just my choice. But that's not necessarily rooted in any type of research. I don't know if that's actually accurate. It's probably definitely not. There's lots of other better places out there. It's just my opinion. It's just my belief. And if people are not stating that, right? If they're stating something as a fact, that's when it becomes a problem. You need to have hard evidence about something. If it's just an opinion, then there's probably not hard evidence behind it. And you need to state that as such. Like either there is evidence to back up what I am saying, or this is just my own opinion and belief. So, being skeptical of media research reports, assertion of scientists, and pseudoscientific research. So pseudoscientists is when seemingly scientific terms are used to substantiate non-scientific claims. There are lots of examples I could give you right now of what is going on there. I won't touch on a lot of them, but there is a lot of pseudoscience that is happening right now. Currently, we are watching it play out in real time, where they're using seemingly scientific terms and scientific processes to substantiate the claims that they're making that are clearly not scientific and rooted in any true research or findings. Another good example of pseudoscience is something, and this has been proven to be pseudoscience, so I can distinctly talk about this one. But it's called facilitated communication. So this was a technique, it's not used anymore, or if it is, that's not good practice, right? So if someone's using this with an individual with disabilities, that's a big red flag. But facilitated communication is a technique that was used with individuals who had some sort of disability. And it's pretty much largely at this point been proven through scientific findings that it lacks any evidence or support behind it. But essentially, what they're doing is the individual is unable to communicate as you or I would talking with language. Okay, so they usually need some sort of device to help them with that. Facilitated communication is a technique that is used where the facilitator has to physically help the person's hand hover and point to whatever button or object on the tablet or whatever it is that they're trying to communicate. So some individuals can navigate those systems on their own, but other individuals do not have the physical capacity to do that. And so what they were doing in facilitated communication is the therapist would hold the hand like this, they would hold the wrist of that individual and help them hover over the button until they pushed the one they wanted. Well, it's pretty much at this point been proven that help the facilitator was giving was a little bit more than help. And they were actually most likely, most of the time, moving the arm rather than just supporting it. They were actually guiding it. Okay. There's a big difference between supporting someone's arm so that they can hold it up and actually guiding it to a certain spot. And largely, there's an overwhelming amount of research that demonstrates that communication that is produced through that method does not come from the individual, but rather it comes from the facilitator because they are guiding those messages. And the research, it's pretty in-depth how they looked at that research, but there's a lot of it. But for a long time, people used that method and they used it with enough scientific terms that it made it appear to be legitimate. It made it look like this is a legitimate procedure that we can use in therapy with our individuals, when in fact it was not. And there was not enough research done to support it to begin with. And then as research started coming out, it largely refuted that that was a good therapy to use. So that's just one example of this. So we're all susceptible to false reports, false scientific findings. I mean, with AI nowadays, like you got to look at images that you see with your own eyes and even ask yourself, like, is that real? Like, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing, right? It's all over the internet. So even seasoned scientists can be really susceptible to these things. But, there's a few rules that we can follow, right? So the first, as I've already said, is be highly skeptical. Be skeptical of scientific assertions that are supported by vague, very little, or very improbable evidence. If they're making a huge claim, example of this is the cause of autism. It is a huge claim to come out and say, this is the one cause of autism after doing a few months of research. When we've been researching autism and the causes of autism for decades now, it is a huge statement to say, we did research for a few months and we found the cause. It's done, found it, done, good. Now we know what causes autism, right? Be skeptical of that because it's improbable, right? It's improbable that we were not able to find the answer after decades of research, but you were able to find the answer with 100% certainty after a few months. I'm not necessarily saying that well, I don't think that it's accurate, but You could argue that they're not necessarily wrong, but there certainly is not enough research yet to make that big of a statement, to make or claim the evidence that they're claiming. It's improbable, right? It's probably not accurate. So if it sounds improbable, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And you need to be skeptical of that, and you need to go back to the research and see what it actually says. Take the time to do that. Take the time to look for supportive evidence. Don't just take what you see and what other people say at face value. People will get annoyed with you. That's okay. That's your job as a scientist, as someone who is a participant in the scientific community. It's very important that we have this skeptic point of view because that's the only way that we're going to make sure that what we're producing for science, what we're producing for medical findings, for mental health findings, and so on, those can only be successful if we're truly looking at the research and we're truly conducting research that is sound. So there are a lot of questions that you want to look for, and you want to be able to answer them. The better you can answer these questions, the more confident you can be that that research study and the findings they have presented are accurate. So can you definitively say what was measured? That's the number one thing you should be looking at, right? I should be able to know right off the bat of a research study, what is it that they were measuring? What were they trying to look at? What behavior did they measure? What medication did they measure? Whatever it may be. What are they measuring? If it is convoluted, if they're measuring multiple things at once, that's a big no-no. There might not be a lot of control there. Are they very vague about what they're measuring? All of these things are red flags, okay? It needs more investigation. If you cannot actually tell what it is they're measuring, there might be a problem there. How do they know that that one variable caused the other? So remember I touched on correlation versus causation. Correlation just means two variables happen to be moving at the same time. Causation means one actually caused a change in the other. If they're making a causal statement, if they're saying this caused this, and it's not just simply a correlation, how do they justify this? There has to be justification for the conclusion of causation happening. Typically, in order to prove this, you need data, you need statistics, you need statistical analysis of some kind that is showing that causation. You need extreme experimental control. You need to make sure that you've ruled out every other variable that could impact your findings, right? So that's another question to ask. We also should be asking, can the results be generalized at all? To who or what can they be generalized? So generalized basically means that they apply to a broad variety of people or instances or treatments or so on. It shouldn't just be that if the findings are so specific that they really only apply to one individual or just the individual in that study, but that it doesn't apply to anyone outside of that, then it can't be generalized, right? Your findings are only good for that very small group of people. And the point of research, and we're going to get into this later on in the semester too, but the entire point of research is that we do start out with a very small number of participants, relatively speaking. When you look at the entire population, the people who actually participate in the study are very few compared to the larger population. But the goal is that they are similar enough to the larger population that the findings we get with them, with that small group, can still be generalized and applied to the larger population so that our findings are good for everyone, right? Not just for a few. So that's a big question that we should be asking of research. Is it generalizable? Does it apply to many people or just the people who were in your study? And it's too specific and it doesn't apply to anything else. And then finally, I think one of the biggest questions, have other researchers found the same thing? Have there been different studies from different labs. I can't hound on that enough either. That have replicated or at least tried to replicate these findings. And were their findings the same or different, right? If you've got multiple labs studying the same phenomena and they're all coming up with different answers, well, that's not good. Something is off. That research is not sound. Nobody has been able to replicate each other. There's a problem, right? So until we have multiple studies from different labs that are replicating and coming out with the exact same findings, only then can we usually make those claims of causation, make those claims that, we found the answer, or we found what is causing this, only when we have that replication. Okay, so in our field and in this class, we're going to be talking about behavioral science specifically. So there are a few goals that we have with behavioral science and in the science of behavior realm. We want to describe the behavior that we're looking at. We're going to go over these in detail in a moment, so I'll just give you the list. We want to be able to describe the behavior that we're looking at. We want to be able to predict it. Can we predict it to some level of control, right? We already talked about this, being able to predict our behavior. We want to be able to determine the causes of behavior. What is actually causing that behavior to occur in a given environment? There are lots of variables in an environment that will result in people engaging in certain behaviors or another. And then finally, we want to understand and explain that behavior that we're observing, predicting, and determining, right? So, or determining causes of. So those are our goals as behavior scientists. So let's look at each of these steps individually. So the first goal, of course, as I've said, is describing behavior. Behavior can be directly observable. We call this type of behavior overt behavior. Or we can also have behaviors that are not directly observable. We call this covert behavior. So to give you an example of each, an overt example of behavior, something we can see, is someone getting up, walking over, and flipping a light switch on, right? If we were to do that in the classroom and you watched someone walk over to switch the light on, that is something we can all observe outwardly, right? Everyone can see it. An example of covert behavior, though, is talking to yourself, right? Let's say reciting your grocery list in your head because you forgot your list at home. That's covert behavior. I don't know that that's what you're reciting in your head, right? Nobody else knows that you're walking around the grocery store reciting your list or sitting in the class trying to remember what it was you were supposed to remember, right? Because it's happening covertly. It's happening just within your own environment and nobody else is really privy to that. Now, we can still measure these things and research these things. We have to find ways to bring the covert to the overt in order to do that. Usually, with things like that, we'll have people talk aloud when they do certain tasks or solve problems, right? We're trying to bring that covert behavior to the overt where we can observe it, but it is still something that can be studied, even though it's covert behavior. And researchers are ultimately interested in describing ways that events are systematically related to one another. That is what we're doing, right? We're saying, is this event related to another event in a systematic way? Is there causation there, right? So do students who study with TV on, excuse me, perform more poorly on exams than those who study in quiet, right? So that is a prediction we can make. That's a research question we can look at. We can systematically measure that, right? We can put a TV on. We can measure how long you're in front of the TV, how loud it is, how much time you spend in front of it, and then we can measure how well you do on the exam, right? So these are things we can measure. Another one, do jurors judge quote unquote attractive defendants more leniently than unattractive defendants? There's actually research on this. The answer is unfortunately yes. But again, that's another research question that we can look at, right? And we can measure this. We can have a level or a scale of attractiveness based on any number of variables that we have to define very clearly. Um, and then we have people rate that person on a scale. And then we do things like show them faces and say, this person committed a crime, or this crime. Do you think they should get this much time or only this much time, right? And see if they're more lenient on those individuals that they categorized as quote unquote attractive versus unattractive. So again, it's things that we can systematically measure and observe that we're looking at. Then we have our second goal, which is predicting behavior. So once we observe that two events are in fact related, so this has to happen with some regularity. Basically, you've observed it more than once, and it's possible to make predictions about that behavior. Then your future predictions are based on your past behavior that has been observed. And through experimentation, you'll sort of see this. So if you collect data, you observe students. Let's go with that example of them studying in front of the TV versus studying in quiet, right? So some study in quiet, we measure that. We measure how long they study. We measure, how quiet it is. And all of those things would be controlled, right? We have to control all the other variables and keep them all the same. So like amount of study time, the subject they're studying, it all has to be the same. The only thing that changes is whether or not it's quiet or the TV is on when they're studying. Okay. Um, and then we give them all the same exam. Okay. So they're all studying the same topic, they're all studying for the same exam. We give them the same exam and we look at the test results. And what we should do is we should do this repeatedly. So you should have your participants come back multiple times for different study sessions, and take different exams. And we do this over and over and over again. And only if we have that replication, results that repeatedly show that students perform better if they study in a quiet environment, only then can you predict future behavior, right? So now, based on all of the past observations of this behavior that we've viewed and collected data on, now we can make a prediction about future behavior. We can say, if a student is studying with the TV on, they're not going to do as well on the next exam. Okay, that's not 100% accurate. We're never going to be 100% accurate. If someone's claiming 100% accuracy, that's a red flag. Okay, but we can usually claim with a high level of accuracy that we measure statistically. And we can predict that. We can make that prediction based on those past behaviors that we observed. So this ability that we have to predict future behavior certainly helps when we're trying to make decisions, right? It's because we as humans, just think about your everyday life, you learn from your past experience. If you've repeatedly studied with the TV on and done poorly on your exams, hopefully you're learning from that experience and you change your behavior. And the opposite can be true. Maybe you study with the TV on and you actually do better. I've heard of people who are able to focus more when there's like noise going on versus in the quiet. Not necessarily TV, but maybe like music or classical music or something like that. Um, but we learn from our past behavior. Here's another simple example, right? Let's say when you were little and you ran out in the rain and you got wet and you were cold. Well, your past behavior was punished, right? You went out in the rain, it was cold, it was freezing, now you're wet and you're uncomfortable. You're probably going to change your behavior, right? Mom or dad or caregiver, grandma, grandpa, whoever that was, taught you that whenever you see rain and you are getting ready to go out in it, you need some things, right? You might need a rain jacket. You might need an umbrella. You might need some type of sweatshirt or long pants or closed-toed shoes, right? There's all types of rules we have to keep you dry and warm when it's raining outside. And we can predict. So because of that learning history that you have from a very young child to now, I can predict with pretty high accuracy that if it's raining, most people are going to grab a raincoat or an umbrella to protect themselves from the rain, right? That's what we mean when we say we can predict behavior based on past behavior. And you as a human will change your behavior based on your past experiences, whether or not your behavior was punished or reinforced. All right, I'm going to stop there for now, and we will pick back up here next Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody.